The throne room of the Galactic Emperor was a spectacle of cold grandeur, a place where ambition met intimidation. Gilded pillars soared into an endless expanse of shimmering light, their surfaces engraved with tales of the Empire's conquests. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of power, and the assembly of alien dignitaries gathered under its vaulted ceilings reflected every corner of the galaxy's diverse splendor. Among the throng were the Emperor's elite guards, each a living monument to the superiority of their respective species. Clad in gleaming armor that bristled with advanced weaponry, they stood in disciplined rows, their gazes fixed on the human warrior who had just stepped into their midst. Lieutenant Adam Cross, humanity's sole representative, was an enigma in their midst. He was unadorned, his battle-worn uniform and compact, unremarkable stature a stark contrast to the imposing figures around him. His calm, almost bored expression was a quiet defiance against the chorus of chuckles and sneers directed at him. The largest of the guards, a Praetorian nearly 3 meters tall with skin like armored plating, leaned toward his comrade and muttered loud enough for all to hear. "This is the human they sent? Looks like a twig that snapped itself," he rumbled, his booming laughter echoing through the hall. Others joined in, some shaking their heads in disbelief, while others openly mocked the frailty of humanity's chosen champion. Cross didn't flinch. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room with the precision of a marksman, taking note of every weapon, every weak point, every escape route. The Emperor, perched high on his golden throne, raised a hand, silencing the room. His voice was as smooth as polished steel. "Today, we gather to assess the worth of humanity. You claim to be a species worthy of our alliance, yet I see no claws, no fangs, no scales. Tell me, human, why should we take you seriously?" Cross stepped forward, his boots clicking against the polished obsidian floor. He stood in the center of the vast chamber, a solitary figure under the harsh glare of alien scrutiny. He looked up at the Emperor, his voice steady and unyielding. "Your Majesty," he said, his tone firm yet respectful. "Humanity doesn't seek your approval through words. We prove our worth through action." The room erupted in murmurs. The Praetorian snorted. "Action? You mean to say you'd fight one of us?" The Emperor's lips curled into an amused smile. "Very well. A demonstration, then. You will face my guards in combat. 3 of them. If you win, humanity will earn our respect. Fail, and your kind will remain irrelevant in the grand scheme of the galaxy." Cross gave a single nod, his expression unreadable. "I accept." The Emperor's smile deepened. So confident, perhaps foolishly so, he gestured toward the guards. "Choose your first opponent." Before Cross could respond, the Praetorian stepped forward, his massive frame dwarfing the human. "I'll go first," he growled. "This will be over before it begins." The guards laughed, and even some of the dignitaries smirked. Cross merely glanced up at the towering alien, his expression unchanging. He unfastened a small device from his belt, a simple combat knife with a blade that hummed faintly with energy. The Praetorian roared with laughter. That's your weapon?" He pounded his chest with both fists. "My hide's thicker than that puny thing can cut." Cross didn't respond. He just stepped back, sliding into a combat stance so fluid it seemed rehearsed to perfection. The Emperor raised his hand again, signaling the start of the fight. "Begin." The Praetorian charged with the force of a landslide, his massive fists aimed to crush the human in a single blow. The floor trembled under his weight, but Cross didn't move until the last possible moment. Then, with an almost lazy grace, he sidestepped, the Praetorian's fist slamming into the ground where he had stood. The crowd gasped as Cross darted behind his opponent, his movements too quick and precise for the eye to follow. The Praetorian spun, swiping at him with a massive arm, but Cross ducked under it, rolling to safety. He wasn't just avoiding blows. He was studying the Praetorian, his sharp eyes locking onto the alien's every movement. "Stand still, you coward," the Praetorian bellowed, slamming his fist down again and again in a futile attempt to hit the human. Cross remained silent, his calm unnerving. He was waiting for something. Finally, he saw it. A moment of hesitation, a slight delay in the Praetorian's recovery after one particularly aggressive strike. Without hesitation, Cross surged forward, his knife flashing. The blade struck a precise point at the base of the Praetorian's neck where his armor didn't fully cover his skin. The alien roared in pain, stumbling backward. Cross didn't relent. He moved like a shadow, his blade slicing again and again into weak points in the Praetorian's armor. Within moments, the towering warrior collapsed, his massive form hitting the ground with a resounding thud. The room fell silent, the laughter and mockery replaced by stunned disbelief. The Praetorian lay groaning, unable to rise. Cross stepped back, lowering his knife, but keeping his stance ready. He looked up at the Emperor, his expression as calm as it had been when he entered the chamber. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Would you like me to choose my next opponent, or will they volunteer?" The Emperor leaned forward on his throne, his amusement replaced by intrigue. The silence in the room stretched for several long moments before the crowd began to murmur, their voices carrying a mix of awe and unease. The Praetorian's comrades helped him to his feet, their expressions ranging from embarrassment to reluctant respect. One of the smaller guards, a Valaxian speedster, sneered and stepped forward. "Luck," he said, his voice high and sharp. The human got lucky. Cross didn't respond. He simply turned his attention to the Valaxian, already analyzing his new opponent. The Emperor smiled once more, though this time it lacked the mocking edge it had held before. "Perhaps this human is not so fragile after all," he mused. "Let us see if his luck holds." Cross didn't wait for the formalities to begin again. In his mind, the next battle had already started. The Valaxian stepped into the arena, his sleek, wiry form shimmering under the artificial lights. His movements were unervingly quick, each step like a blur, as if the air itself bent to his will. His armor, light and almost organic in appearance, clung to his body, designed for speed and agility. Two glowing plasma blades extended from his wrists, casting an eerie blue light that hummed with lethal energy. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. This was a spectacle they understood, a contest of raw speed against the human's apparent luck. The Valaxian smirked, his sharp features twisting with disdain. The Praetorian was clumsy. "Strength without speed is nothing but a slow death," he sneered, circling Cross like a predator toying with prey. "You won't be so fortunate this time, human." Cross didn't reply. His stance was unshaken, his combat knife held loosely at his side. His focus was absolute, his piercing gaze locked onto the Valaxian. He made no move to circle back, no effort to match the alien's theatrics. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his presence like a calm eye in the midst of a brewing storm. The Emperor raised his hand once more, the signal to begin. The Valaxian didn't hesitate. In a flash, he vanished, a blur of motion too fast for the untrained eye to follow. Gasps rippled through the audience as the alien reappeared behind Cross, his plasma blades slicing toward the human's back. But Cross was no ordinary opponent. He sidestepped at the last possible moment, the plasma blades missing him by mere inches. The Valaxian vanished again, darting to the side, his movements erratic and unpredictable. Each time, Cross evaded, his reactions impossibly sharp. The Valaxian's frustration was palpable. "Why don't you fight back, human?" he spat, his voice a venomous hiss. Cross remained silent, his breathing steady, his knife still at his side. He wasn't evading aimlessly, he was observing. Every blur of movement, every feint, every strike. He was mapping the Valaxian's patterns, cataloging weaknesses in his mind. The Valaxian darted in again, this time feigning left before lunging right. Cross dodged once more, but the alien was ready. Twisting midair, the Valaxian struck with his opposite blade, aiming for Cross's midsection. There was a flash of light and the hiss of searing heat as the blade grazed Cross's side, burning through the fabric of his uniform. The crowd erupted in cheers as blood began to stain the torn material. The Valaxian grinned triumphantly, already celebrating his victory. But Cross didn't falter. His expression remained calm, his posture unbroken. He reached to his side, pressing a small patch onto the wound to stem the bleeding. "You're fast," he said finally, his voice even, almost conversational. The Valaxian's grin widened. "Faster than you'll ever be, human." "Maybe," Cross replied, his tone betraying no emotion. "But speed without control? That's nothing but chaos." The Valaxian sneered, clearly unimpressed. He darted forward again, his movements a blur of unpredictability. But this time, Cross didn't dodge. He shifted just enough to redirect the Valaxian's momentum, forcing the alien to stumble slightly as his strike missed its mark. The audience gasped again, their cheers faltering. The Valaxian recovered quickly, but something had changed. His movements, once fluid and effortless, were now slightly more erratic. He darted back, circling Cross, his confidence beginning to waver. "You're hesitating," Cross observed, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The Valaxian snarled, lunging forward with renewed ferocity. But Cross was ready. He sidestepped the first strike, parried the second with his knife, and then spun, slamming the hilt of his weapon into the back of the Valaxian's head. The alien staggered, his speed faltering as he struggled to recover. Cross didn't give him the chance. In a fluid motion, he activated a small device on his wrist, a modified EMP emitter. A pulse of energy radiated out, shorting the Valaxian's plasma blades and leaving him momentarily disoriented. The Valaxian froze, his weapons sputtering out of existence. His wide eyes locked on Cross, a flicker of fear replacing his earlier arrogance. What did you do?" "Adapted," Cross replied simply. Before the Valaxian could react, Cross closed the distance between them. His movements were a blur, not of unnatural speed, but of efficiency honed by years of training. He struck with precision, his knife slicing through the exposed joints of the Valaxian's armor. The alien cried out, dropping to one knee as Cross stepped back, his weapon still held steady. The room fell silent, the crowd stunned into disbelief. The Valaxian, once a blur of unstoppable motion, now knelt before the human, defeated. Cross's breathing was heavy, but his expression remained calm. He wiped his blade on the edge of his uniform before returning it to its sheath. Then, he turned to face the Emperor, his posture straight despite the blood staining his side. "Two down," he said, his voice steady despite the toll the fight had taken on him. "Who's next?" The Emperor leaned forward, his expression a mix of curiosity and respect. For the first time, there was no trace of mockery in his gaze. The crowd, too, seemed different. The laughter and jeers that had filled the room earlier were now replaced with murmurs of uncertainty and awe. The Valaxian was helped to his feet by his comrades, his head hanging low in shame. One of the guards, a massive cyborg enforcer with a body reinforced by gleaming metallic enhancements, stepped forward, his mechanical limbs whirring ominously. "I'll put an end to this farce," the enforcer growled, his voice distorted by the mechanical augmentations in his throat. Cross didn't react. His eyes were already scanning the cyborg, assessing his opponent with the same unyielding focus he had shown before. The Emperor raised his hand once more, signaling the start of the next battle. But this time, the crowd was quiet, their attention fixed entirely on the human who had already defied their expectations twice. As the cyborg stepped into the arena, his metallic frame casting an imposing shadow, Cross tightened his grip on his knife. He knew the next battle would push him to his limits, but he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Humanity had already begun to carve its place in the galaxy. The cyborg enforcer loomed over the arena, a walking fortress of steel and circuitry. His heavy steps reverberated through the chamber, each one an announcement of his overwhelming presence. Hydraulic limbs hummed with barely restrained power, and the barrel of an integrated plasma cannon on his right arm glowed faintly, as though anticipating the carnage to come. His artificial eyes glinted red, scanning Cross with machine-like precision, and a synthesized voice boomed across the room. "Human," the cyborg said, "your resilience is commendable but irrelevant. Flesh and blood cannot triumph over metal and technology. Surrender now, and perhaps your defeat will be painless." Cross tilted his head slightly, his expression betraying no fear. The wound on his side throbbed under the patch he'd applied earlier, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on the towering figure before him. He flexed his fingers around the hilt of his knife, his mind already racing through possible strategies. "You talk a lot for a machine," Cross said coolly, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. The cyborg's mechanical face twisted into a grim facsimile of a smile. "Bold. I'll enjoy dismantling you." The Emperor's hand rose once again, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Begin." The cyborg wasted no time. A burst of energy shot from his plasma cannon, the bright streak of blue light searing through the air. Cross dove to the side, the blast missing him by inches and scorching the ground where he'd stood moments before. The Enforcer charged after him, moving with surprising speed for his size, his metal limbs propelling him forward with relentless momentum. Cross rolled to his feet, narrowly dodging a crushing blow as the cyborg's massive fist slammed into the ground, leaving a crater in the obsidian floor. The shockwave threw Cross backward, and he skidded across the ground, the impact jarring but not debilitating. The crowd gasped as the human struggled to his feet, his movements slower now, the toll of the previous battles evident in the stiffness of his limbs. The cyborg straightened, his towering frame casting a shadow over Cross. "Is this the best humanity has to offer?" The Enforcer taunted, his plasma cannon charging for another shot. Cross didn't answer. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations, every action carefully weighed against the odds of survival. The cyborg's size and power were his greatest assets, but they also made him predictable. Every swing of his fists, every blast from his cannon, it was all brute force, no finesse. The cyborg fired again, and Cross darted to the side, this time running directly toward his opponent. The sudden, audacious move caught the Enforcer off guard, and for a split second, he hesitated. It was all Cross needed. He slid under the cyborg's outstretched arm, his knife flashing as he slashed at the cables running along the back of the Enforcer's knee joint. Sparks erupted as the blade found its mark, and the cyborg staggered, his movement faltering. "You're faster than I calculated," the Enforcer admitted, his tone devoid of frustration, just cold mechanical analysis. But not fast enough. With a deafening roar, the cyborg swung his arm in a wide arc, forcing Cross to leap backward. The human's foot slipped slightly on the slick floor, and the cyborg seized the opportunity. His massive hand closed around Cross's torso, lifting him off the ground like a child holding a toy. The crowd gasped, many assuming this was the end. Cross struggled against the iron grip, his knife useless against the reinforced plating of the cyborg's arm. The Enforcer raised him higher, his glowing eyes locking onto Cross's. "This is the difference between us, human," the cyborg said. "You are fragile, weak, and now you will break." But Cross wasn't finished. His free hand fumbled at his belt, pulling free a small cylindrical device no larger than a finger. With a grimace of determination, he pressed it against the cyborg's arm, right where the cables controlling his grip were exposed. The device emitted a high-pitched whine before discharging a pulse of electromagnetic energy. The cyborg's arm convulsed, his grip loosening as his systems momentarily overloaded. Cross twisted free, dropping to the ground and landing in a crouch. The Enforcer staggered back, his movements jerky as his systems attempted to recalibrate. Cross didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the cyborg, leaping onto his back and driving his knife into a cluster of exposed circuitry at the base of the Enforcer's neck. Sparks flew, and the cyborg let out a distorted roar of pain. "System error," the Enforcer growled, his movements becoming more erratic. "System failing." Cross held on tightly as the cyborg thrashed, trying to dislodge him. With a final, calculated strike, he plunged the knife deeper, severing the critical connection. The cyborg froze, his red eyes dimming as his massive body collapsed to the ground with a deafening crash. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the crowd erupted, a cacophony of disbelief and awe. Cross rolled off the fallen Enforcer, landing hard on the floor. He lay there for a moment, catching his breath, his body screaming in protest. The Emperor stood, his expression unreadable as he looked down at the human who had defied every expectation. "Rise," Adam Cross, he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. Cross pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly, but refusing to fall. He looked up at the Emperor, his face bruised and bloodied, but filled with quiet determination. "You have proven yourself," the Emperor said, his tone carrying a mix of respect and curiosity. "Humanity's place in the galaxy is no longer in question." Cross nodded, his hand still clutching his knife. He knew the fight wasn't over. Not really. This was just the beginning, a single step in a much larger battle for recognition and survival. As the crowd murmured and the fallen cyborg was carried away, Cross turned and walked toward the chamber's exit. He could feel the eyes of the galaxy on him, their opinions shifting, their assumptions crumbling. Humanity had made its mark, and Adam Cross, battered but unbroken, had shown them what it meant to fight, not with claws or scales or plasma cannons, but with the unyielding spirit of a species that refused to be underestimated. The chamber trembled as the next challenger entered the arena. A sharp, unnatural chill descended upon the air, and the temperature seemed to plummet as if the room itself recoiled from the creature that emerged. The figure was shrouded in shadow, its form indistinct yet monstrous. Wisps of dark energy swirled around its body, distorting the light and creating an aura of malevolence that made the crowd fall silent. This was no ordinary opponent. This was the Emperor's personal champion, an entity whispered about in hushed tones, the Shade Warden. It was said to be a being forged from pure energy, its power unparalleled, its form unkillable. The Emperor watched with a slight smile, his expression a mix of intrigue and anticipation. Cross stood in the center of the arena, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. He'd faced overwhelming strength and unmatched speed, but this was different. The Shade Warden radiated an oppressive presence, an otherworldly dread that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He tightened his grip on his knife, its blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. The Warden stepped forward, its movements fluid and soundless, as though it existed in a realm just beyond the physical. Its voice echoed, not from a mouth, but directly into the minds of those present. "You are outmatched, human. Your kind was never meant to stand before the void." The words clawed at Cross's psyche, filling him with an instinctual dread that he forced himself to suppress. He took a step forward, his boots scuffing against the arena floor. "Void or not, you'll fall like the rest," he said, his voice steady despite the cold not forming in his gut. The Warden didn't respond. It raised an arm, and the dark energy around it coalesced into a jagged spear of shadow. Without warning, it hurled the weapon, and Cross barely had time to react. He dove to the side, the spear striking the ground behind him and exploding into a burst of darkness that sent shockwaves rippling across the chamber. The crowd erupted in murmurs, their fear palpable. The Warden didn't let up, summoning more shadowy projectiles and launching them in rapid succession. Cross ducked and weaved, the sheer force of each blast threatening to overwhelm him. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones, sapping his strength with every step. "This is not a battle you can win," the Warden said, its voice reverberating through his skull. "You are nothing but a fleeting light, easily snuffed out." Cross gritted his teeth, his mind racing. His knife was useless against something that seemed more energy than matter. But then he remembered the EMP device he'd used earlier. It had disrupted the cyborg systems. Could it have a similar effect on this creature? As he dodged another attack, he reached for his belt, pulling out the last EMP cylinder. It was small and fragile, and he only had one shot. The Warden must have noticed, as it stopped its assault and tilted its head in curiosity. Desperation, it said. How quaint. Cross activated the device, the high-pitched whine piercing through the arena. He hurled it toward the Warden, the cylinder spinning through the air before detonating in a burst of energy. For a moment, the shadows around the Warden flickered, its form destabilizing. But then, to Cross's horror, the creature reformed, the dark energy swirling back into place. It laughed, a hollow, chilling sound that echoed through the chamber. "Your toys are meaningless against the void," it said, stepping closer. Cross's mind raced. The EMP hadn't worked, but it had disrupted the warden briefly. That meant it wasn't invulnerable. It had a form, even if it was cloaked in shadow. He just needed to find a way to strike at its core. The warden lashed out with a wave of darkness, and Cross barely managed to block it with his knife. The blade sparked as it collided with the energy, and Cross noticed something. A faint shimmer in the warden's chest, like a glowing ember hidden within the shadows. That was it. The core. The warden loomed over him, its shadowy form expanding as if to swallow him whole. "This ends now, human," it said, raising a massive tendril of darkness. Cross acted on instinct. He lunged forward, his knife aimed directly at the shimmer in the warden's chest. The tendril came crashing down, grazing his back and sending a wave of pain through his body. But he didn't stop. With a roar, he drove the blade into the core, the metal sinking into the energy like a lightning rod piercing a storm. The warden let out a deafening screech, its form convulsing as the shadows around it writhed and dissipated. Cross held onto the knife, his muscles straining as the energy surged around him, threatening to consume him. But he didn't let go. With one final, ear-splitting scream, the warden exploded in a burst of light and shadow, the force throwing Cross backward. He hit the ground hard, his vision swimming as the crowd erupted in chaos. When the dust settled, the arena was silent once more. The warden was gone, its form reduced to nothing but faint wisps of smoke. Cross lay on the ground, his body battered and broken but alive. He struggled to sit up, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The Emperor rose from his throne, his expression unreadable as he looked down at the human warrior who had just defeated his most formidable champion. "You continue to surprise me, Adam Cross," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine respect. Cross managed to push himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He looked up at the Emperor, his knife still clutched tightly in his hand. "What can I say?" he said, his voice hoarse but defiant. "Humans don't know when to quit." The crowd, stunned into silence moments ago, erupted into cheers and applause. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to shake the very walls of the chamber. For the first time, they weren't mocking or jeering. They were celebrating. Cross looked around, his expression weary but triumphant. He had done what no one thought possible. He had stood against the galaxy's best and proven that humanity was more than they had ever imagined. But in the back of his mind, he knew the battle wasn't over. This victory was just the beginning. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of the Emperor's throne descending from its elevated platform. Cross, still standing in the center of the arena, gripped his knife with bloodied fingers. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, yet his gaze remained locked on the figure approaching him. The Emperor's crimson robes shimmered in the low light, his crown-like circlet gleaming with an alien brilliance. "You've proven your strength, Adam Cross," the Emperor said, his voice as smooth and commanding as ever. Each word carried the weight of centuries of rule, reverberating through the vast chamber. "But strength is not enough. What you've shown here is defiance, an admirable quality, yet a dangerous one in the wrong hands." Cross straightened, his chest heaving. "You called me here to prove humanity's worth," he said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I've done that. Or is this just another game to you?" The Emperor stopped a few paces away, his expression unreadable. Around them, the spectators were deathly quiet, their earlier cheers now replaced by an uneasy anticipation. The galaxy had never seen anything like this, a human warrior standing toe-to-toe with the most powerful being in existence. "Proving your worth," the Emperor echoed, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Perhaps, but this was also a test of character. Strength alone doesn't secure survival in this galaxy. It's cunning, resolve, and the ability to make difficult choices that truly determine one's fate." Cross's eyes narrowed. He knew there was more to this. The Emperor wasn't one to speak without purpose, and every word felt like a prelude to something far greater. "Get to the point," he said. The Emperor's smile faded, replaced by a somber expression. "The galaxy is on the brink of chaos. he said, his tone grave. The Unity Accord, the fragile treaty that has kept the major powers from tearing each other apart, is crumbling. And humanity, your people, stands at the crossroads. Will you rise as a beacon of hope or descend into the same cycle of destruction that has plagued countless civilizations before you? Cross frowned, the weight of the Emperor's words sinking in. He'd heard whispers of galactic instability during his time as a mercenary, but he dismissed them as rumors. Now, standing before the Emperor himself, it was impossible to ignore the gravity of the situation. "And where do I fit into this?" Cross asked, his voice cautious. The Emperor stepped closer, his piercing gaze locked onto Cross. "You've shown the galaxy what humanity is capable of," he said. "But this victory comes at a cost. Your actions today have drawn the attention of those who see humanity not as a potential ally, but as a threat. There are powers in this galaxy that would rather see your species wiped out than risk allowing you to rise." Cross felt a chill run down his spine. He'd fought to prove humanity's worth, to show that they weren't the fragile, insignificant race the galaxy believed them to be. But now, it seemed that his success had only painted a target on their backs. "So, what are you saying?" Cross asked, his voice low. The Emperor extended a hand, his expression unreadable. "Join me," he said. "Stand by my side as humanity's champion. Together, we can guide your people through the storm that's coming. I can offer protection, resources, and a seat at the table of galactic power. But in return, you must pledge your loyalty to the Empire." Cross stared at the outstretched hand, his mind racing. The offer was tempting, too tempting. With the Emperor's backing, humanity could secure its place in the galaxy, avoid the wars and conflicts that had plagued so many others. But at what cost? He thought of Earth, of the people who had sent him here with hope in their hearts. He thought of the sacrifices he'd made, the lives he'd taken to get to this moment. And he thought of the Shade Warden's words, still echoing in his mind. "You are nothing but a fleeting light, easily snuffed out." Cross took a step back, his grip tightening on his knife. "Humanity doesn't need a leash," he said, his voice firm. "We'll carve our own path, just like we always have. And if that means facing the storm alone, so be it." The Emperor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the air grew cold. But then, to Cross's surprise, the Emperor let out a low chuckle. "Defiant to the end," he said, his tone almost amused. "Perhaps that's why you've come this far." He turned, his robes billowing behind him as he began to ascend back to his throne. "Very well, Adam Cross," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You've made your choice. But know this, the storm is coming, whether you're ready for it or not. And when it does, I hope you'll remember this moment." Cross watched as the Emperor returned to his place, his figure silhouetted against the brilliant light of the throne. The arena was silent, the spectators unsure of how to react. But Cross didn't wait for their approval. He turned and began to walk toward the exit, each step heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. As he passed through the massive gates, the crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and shouts. Some praised his bravery, others condemned his defiance. But Cross didn't look back. His mission wasn't to win their approval. It was to secure humanity's future. The hallway beyond the arena was dimly lit, the echoes of the crowd fading with each step. Cross let out a shaky breath, the adrenaline finally wearing off. His body ached, his mind was clouded with doubt, but his resolve remained unshaken. The storm was coming, just as the Emperor had said. But humanity had faced storms before. They had survived wars, plagues, and extinction-level events. They had endured when the odds were stacked against them, when the galaxy had written them off as insignificant. And they would endure again. Cross tightened his grip on his knife, its blade still stained with the energy of the battles he had fought. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Humanity wouldn't go down without a fight. As he stepped into the docking bay, a familiar voice called out, "Cross!" He turned to see Dr. Alara Morn running toward him, her face a mix of relief and worry. "You're alive," she said, her voice trembling. "Barely," Cross said with a weak smile. "Didn't think I'd make it out of there." Alara shook her head, her expression softening. "You always find a way," she said. Cross glanced back at the arena, its towering structure casting a long shadow over the bay. "Yeah," he said, "but this is just the beginning." Elara followed his gaze, her brow furrowed. "What did he say to you?" Cross hesitated, the Emperor's words echoing in his mind. "He warned me about what's coming," he said, "and he made me an offer." Alara's eyes widened. "Did you take it?" "No," Cross said, his voice firm. "I'm not selling out humanity for a seat at his table." Alara nodded, a hint of pride in her expression. "So what now?" Cross looked toward the stars, the endless expanse of the galaxy stretching out before them. "Now we get ready," he said, "because when the storm comes, we're going to show the galaxy what humans are really made of." With that, he boarded the ship, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders, but his determination burning brighter than ever. Humanity's fight was far from over, but for the first time, they had hope. And that was all they needed.